Everyone believed the palace was made of gold and silk. But I knew better. It was built on secrets, laced with poison. And beneath every soft footstep was a crack in the marble. A place where blood had dried long before mine. I was born into a noble house that commanded both trade and war horses. Our banners flew high in the capital, embroidered in crimson and gold. To the world, we were untouchable. But even golden cages gleam brightest before they trap you. I was the only daughter. Spoiled, sheltered, smothered in silks and sweet tea. But behind every gift was a guard. Behind every smile a rule. My father, oh, how he adored me. He called me his little hawk. Said I had eyes too sharp for a girl and a spirit too wild for a wife. My elder brother trained with swords. My younger ones still played with birds. And I wasn't supposed to want more than embroidery and betrothals. But I did. I was 14 when I first saw him. The boy in silver. The sword tournament blazed under the summer sun. My brother was set to compete, and I snuck away from my governess and hid behind the crimson pavilion curtain. That's when I saw him. He wasn't the strongest. But gods, he moved like wind slicing through fire. Graceful, silent, hungry, and beautiful in the way danger often is. A beauty that doesn't ask to be loved. It simply is. My heart didn't flutter. It stopped. And in that silence, I sealed my own fate. I begged my brother to bring him into our house, to make him one of ours. He agreed, more for my sake than the boy's talent. And just like that, the stranger stepped through our gates. My father gave him clothes. My brother gave him swords. And I gave him everything else. He never once asked for my heart. But he took it anyway, quietly, completely. He lived in the main house. A guard, they called him. But he became something more. He read books in the study I used to haunt alone. He brushed his fingers over the piano keys I once abandoned. He took space I hadn't known I'd left vacant. Until he filled it. And one evening, just before dusk, when the lanterns glowed like fireflies and the jasmine bloomed, he turned to me and said, "I will ask your father for your hand when I return." He was to ride out with my father and our guards, to handle a dispute on my uncle's lands. A small skirmish, they said. A minor rebellion. I believed them. I wore the blue robe he once said brought out the stars in my eyes. I waited for him with trembling hands. I imagined our wedding, our future, our home, within these same walls, safe and watched over by love. But what returned to me was ruin. Everyone saw me as the noble girl with everything. The pearls, the smile, the gentle voice that never rose above the wind. But no one saw how sharp my silence truly was. They trained me in embroidery, etiquette, and illusion. But when I was 6, my elder brother taught me how to read between the glances of court men. And by 9, my uncle's betrayal taught me that not every kind gesture is meant to be kind. Still, I stayed quiet. Because I knew that in a palace built on glass, even the sound of your breath could cause an avalanche. My stepmother smiled at me each morning with a voice dipped in honey. But the bees were dead in her garden. My stepsister, all in, trailed behind her like a shadow with silk ribbons and a gaze too cold for her age. She always reached for what was mine, my gowns, my jade combs, my father's hand. But I gave, and I gave. Because my father loved me, and in this world, that love was a shield stronger than any sword. Or so I thought. Then came the tournament. It was a spring day laced with the scent of peach blossoms and blood. My brother was preparing to spar. A demonstration of strength before the Emperor's envoy. He allowed me to sit close, veiled, masked by a curtain of gauze. I wasn't meant to be seen. But I saw him. He stepped into the ring not like a soldier, but like a storm that had been waiting for its moment. Broad-shouldered, wrapped in simple dark robes, a blade tied to his back like it was a part of his spine. His face was not beautiful in the way poems described. It was more dangerous than that. He looked like he could cut the moon in half if he chose to. And when he glanced toward the crowd, his gaze stopped. On me. Even through the veil, even through the crowd. He saw me. My breath paused. The air trembled. I told my brother that day. We need him. Not just as a guard. Not just as a sword. But as something closer. And, because I was adored, my father invited him to our home. His name was Shin. They gave him rooms in the main house. They gave him new robes, a teacher to read, a horse to ride. But it was me who gave him the smile he never stopped chasing. It was me who defended him when the elders whispered about his unknown bloodline. And it was me who fell foolishly, deeply, completely. He taught me swordplay in the garden courtyard. Late at night, under moonlight, while servants slept and petals fell silently around us. He would press the hilt into my palm and whisper, "Even the softest hands must know how to bleed." And I believed that was his way of protecting me. I didn't know then. He was sharpening the blade that would end me. Everyone thought he was just a low-born soldier with a handsome face. But I saw something else. Something he didn't even try to hide from me. He watched the court with the eyes of a starving wolf dressed in silk. Charming, quiet, clever, and far too perfect. I thought it was me he loved. The way he leaned in when I spoke. The way his eyes followed only me in a room full of women with sharper tongues and older bloodlines. He touched me like I was rare silk. He whispered to me like I was worth waiting for. And maybe, back then, I believed it. But the thing about predators is that they don't attack until the prey is tame. He knew how to play this palace. He played my brothers like cards. He bowed to my father like a loyal son. He even kissed the hem of my stepmother's robe, though she hated him, and I hated her more. But no one suspected the depth of his hunger. Not then. I remember the first time he touched a sword in our courtyard. He bowed. He smiled. He said nothing. But in 5 moves, he disarmed 2 of my father's most trusted guards. I clapped like a child. He smiled at me again. And I never realized it was the same smile he would wear the day I died. That season, the palace was preparing for the Spring Moon Festival. There was music, lanterns, endless silks ordered for every concubine and lady of the court. And I remember watching the lights sway from my window and thinking, if I marry him, this world will be mine to keep safe. Ours to build. But that world was already rotting. And I was too in love to smell the decay. One night, just before the festival, I overheard whispers behind the curtains of the garden pavilion. His voice, low and deliberate, and someone else's, sharp like steel drawn in moonlight. "I'm close," he said. "She already believes I'll ask for her hand. Her brother trusts me. Her father leaves the estate in my hands more and more." A pause. Then the voice that wasn't his replied, "Good. When the seal is in your hand, the estate is ours. But don't get sentimental. She's just a step. She's the key," he replied. Nothing more. My breath caught. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. I had heard him say it. She's just a step. And yet, that same night, when he came to find me in the corridor, his eyes were soft again. He reached for my hand. He smiled that same gentle smile. And I said nothing. I was already learning. Learning how to wear my own mask. Learning how betrayal feels not like a sword in your back, but like a kiss on the forehead. That was the moment the girl who loved him began to die. And the woman who would trap him began to awaken. They all believed I had healed. They saw my return to court with silk draped over my shoulders, a soft smile painted on my lips, and a new stillness in my step that looked like grace. But it wasn't grace. It was the restraint of a blade. I remember the day I returned from the mountains. The physicians had said I'd suffered a fever after the grief, that the collapse at the wedding hall had taken my memory, that I was fragile and should be kept away from court affairs. I let them say it. I let them believe it. I let them cover my survival with a lie, because what better disguise is there than a woman too broken to see through betrayal? But I remembered everything, every word he whispered to her, every plan they made. Every tie they used to bind me before they thought I died. He thought he had buried me beneath scandal and grief. He thought I had no breath left to scream. But I didn't need breath. I only needed time. When I entered the palace gardens again, the cherry blossoms had not yet bloomed. The skies were still dull, gray with the threat of another rain, but the court welcomed me with warmth, or rather, with watchful curiosity. "Lady Yaren has returned," they said, pretending they hadn't written me off. I walked with the same posture my stepmother once mocked as too proud. This time, I wore it like armor. He was there. Of course he was. Standing by the edge of the koi pond, dressed finer than before, with the golden insignia my father once wore now glittering over his chest like stolen treasure. When our eyes met, he blinked once, and I knew he thought I didn't remember. "Lady Yaren," he said, stepping forward as if his voice still had the power to melt me. I gave him the smallest of bows. "My lord," I replied, as if his name had long since left my tongue. I saw the flicker of confusion, of doubt. Good. Let it grow. At night, I studied the court like a map. I marked every new alliance he had made, every whisper traded behind silken curtains, every smile that lingered too long. My former stepsister, now his second wife, walked around the estate like she belonged. She wore my silks. She arranged the gardens in my mother's style. She even dismissed the servants who once braided my hair. But she could not erase my scent from the halls, because I had planted it there. In ink, in wax, in blood. I had left a trail behind, long before they thought I was gone. And now I was tracing it back. On the 12th night, I met a man beneath the plum trees. He was tall, quiet, and rarely smiled, a strategist known to no one but the retired General Sue, who once taught my brother the art of war. "I heard you were dead," he said, folding his arms as the plum blossoms trembled in the breeze. I smiled. "Only the foolish believed that," I said. "The wise waited." He stared at me, then nodded. "What do you want from me?" I turned my gaze toward the tower where my former fiancé now resided, holding stolen authority like a crown. "I want him to fall," I said. "Not with swords, not with fire, but with silence. I want him to hear the echo of every lie he ever told, in his own voice." That night, I drank plum wine for the first time in 2 years. It tasted sweet, but I knew now what sweet things could hide. And I smiled, knowing the poison was not in the wine. It was in me. No one saw the way my hand trembled when I poured the wine. No one noticed that my smile had stopped reaching my eyes, because I made sure they didn't. In this palace of jade floors and silk-robed nobility, everyone wears a mask. Mine was simply better fitted this time. He stood across the pavilion that day, speaking with my father as if the very walls didn't remember the blood he once let stain them. My stepmother glided past me, her perfume cloying, her laughter falsely sweet. My stepsister twirled in her new gown like a child. They were all so comfortable, so confident that I had been reborn docile, a flower with no thorns. But what they did not realize was that I had learned how to bloom in poison. That day, I smiled. I curtsied. I played the soft daughter and sweeter sister. I listened. I observed. I tucked every word, every whisper, every glance into a ledger inside my mind. Because revenge is not served in flames. It is sipped slowly, like plum wine. I began with the guards. The ones who once turned their backs the night I died, some bought, some scared, some simply too indifferent. I replaced them, one by one. No one noticed how the quiet steward began bringing in new recruits. No one paid attention when I insisted on reorganizing household efficiency as a dutiful daughter. But I was assembling my army. Then came the shadows. I found her, a former maid who had seen too much and spoken too little. I gave her gold, protection, and the title of Madam of Linens, though her true task was to whisper secrets from every chamber, every hallway. Information flowed like silk into my lap. The merchant my stepsister often flirted with, already married and quite publicly in the outer provinces. The letters my stepmother sent to her birth family? Laced with ambitions and hints of poison, she planned to slip into my brother's regimen. Even the man I once loved, he had grown desperate. Each noble house rejected his offers, his training, his requests for titles. He didn't know why. But I knew, because I wrote the rejection letters myself. One night, I met him in the gardens. "You look different," he said, voice low, eyes searching. "Time will do that to a woman," I answered, sipping tea that was not meant for sharing. Especially a woman who once believed in fairy tales. He reached for my hand. I let him, because letting him believe I still felt something was part of the game. "Do you remember the promise I made you beneath the plum trees?" he whispered. "I remember promises," I said, "and how easily they break." The moonlight glistened on his face, but I felt nothing. No flutter. No longing. Only purpose. Only the steady fire behind my ribs. Because vengeance is colder than grief, and I had no tears left to shed. By the end of the moon festival, the pieces were in place. My father trusted me. My brother confided in me. The servants feared me. And they, the ones who wore masks of love and loyalty, they still believed I was the same girl they had once buried beneath lies. But I had become something else. Something they could not name. And soon, they would learn. It was a night of music and lanterns, of laughter that rippled over courtyards paved in gold. They thought it was a celebration, a feast to honor my brother's recovery. But I had orchestrated it as a stage, and they, my players, danced blindly to the script I had written in silence. I wore white that night. Not red, as expected. Not the colors of power or seduction. But mourning, a subtle message, one only he noticed. "You look like a ghost," he said as we met under the willow tree. I smiled. "Maybe I am." My stepsister glared from the dais where she sat beside my father, pretending to be a dutiful daughter. My stepmother clutched her wine goblet like it held her fate. In many ways, it did. I had invited every noble family, and I had ensured they would all witness the end of a farce. The first scandal broke just after the first course. A servant stumbled forward, trembling, holding a letter. A forged note, yes, but based on very real confessions, collected by the maid I had embedded in my stepmother's inner circle. My father's face turned pale. His eyes scanned the parchment that revealed months of betrayal. How his own wife had tampered with his son's medicine. How she had whispered poison into the ears of councilmen. There was chaos. Shouts. Cups fell. Guards moved. But I stayed seated, composed, because the storm was mine. Then came her turn, my stepsister. A voice rang out from the crowd. Another letter. Another truth unveiled. Her scandal? A falsified engagement to a noble who publicly denounced her that night, declaring her letters false and her words dangerous. She wept. Oh, how she wept. She turned to the one man she thought would defend her. He, the one who once whispered love into my ears, now held her hand. But his name had already been added to the list, because the next scroll revealed how he had conspired with both women. How he had sought noble titles through seduction, deception, and forged loyalty. My father looked at me, and I looked back. "Do you believe me now?" I asked softly. He did not answer, but his eyes said everything. That night, punishments were declared. My stepmother was stripped of title and sent to a convent. My stepsister, banished from the capital. He was imprisoned, awaiting judgment from the emperor himself. And me? I stood in the pavilion as the last lanterns floated into the sky. I had survived death. I had walked through betrayal. And now I stood reborn, not from grace or vengeance, but from clarity. Because I no longer needed their love. I had become something far more powerful than they had ever feared. A woman who remembered. And acted. They thought the storm had passed. The palace was quiet now. No more whispers in the halls. No more coins changing hands under shadow. No more midnight rendezvous behind silk curtains. But the silence wasn't peace. It was tension. Drawn tight like the string of a bow. because the final arrow had not yet flown, and the one I aimed it at wasn't my stepsister, wasn't the man who betrayed me with kisses sharper than swords. It was him, the one who stood back, always quiet, always watching, the man who never touched the dagger but handed them the sheath, the man whose hands stayed clean because he let others get dirty. He wore loyalty like perfume, sweet but artificial. And I was so busy looking for blood on the floor, I never looked at the one holding the map. He was the one I trusted with my secrets, my movements, my fears, my name. And while I was building my trap, he was building a door behind it, one that would let him slip away with everything I'd fought for. He never raised a hand, but he always knew when to look away. And now that the court had crumbled, now that my betrayers had been dragged into the light, he smiled, that faint, unreadable curve of the lips that said, "You did all the work. I'll take what's left." I should have seen it sooner. But sometimes, the most dangerous ones are the ones who never lie. They just never tell the truth. I remembered the day I first met him, in the rain. When no one else offered me shelter, he held an umbrella. When no one else looked me in the eye, he bowed. But now I see it clearly. He didn't offer kindness. He offered calculation. He saw a storm and found a way to profit from it. I was never his mission. I was his method. So that night, I lit a candle not for him, but for me. For the girl I used to be. Naive, trusting, soft-spoken. The girl who thought kindness was always pure. And I whispered a promise over the flame. I will never be fooled by silence again. He came to my chamber that evening, cloaked in casual grace. He poured the tea himself, said congratulations, offered to help me govern now that the throne was stabilized. I smiled, the same smile I gave before I burned an empire. And when he lifted his cup, he found a letter beneath it, sealed with the same wax I used to expose my enemies. He opened it slowly, and read his own name on the page under charges of treason by omission. He looked up, finally rattled. But I was already walking away. "I won't kill you," I said. "I want you to live, to watch everything you schemed for blossom without you." And as the doors closed behind me, the palace, my palace, felt warm for the first time in years. Because true power wasn't in taking the crown. It was in choosing who no longer had the right to sit beside it. They draped me in silk that morning. Crimson and gold. Colors of power. Of legacy. Of blood. The court bowed low, but all I could hear was silence. The kind that comes after a war. Not peace. Not yet. Just silence. I stood beneath the arched pavilion, wind lifting the edge of my sleeves, the scent of incense curling like ghosts through the open air. A crown rested on the velvet cushion before me. Light caught the metal, and for a moment, it looked like fire. I had not asked for it. I had not begged or bargained or schemed for it, but somehow, through ashes and betrayal and quiet vengeance, it had found its way to me. The crown, heavy not with gold, but with memory. They called me Empress, but I did not smile. Because I was still that girl once, the girl who ran barefoot through gardens, dreaming of love, not thrones. And yet, here I was, with blades disguised as courtiers, with shadows still lurking beneath silks, and with a kingdom that now looked to me not for beauty or obedience, but for justice. I took the crown in my hands. It was cold, unforgiving, like the night I died, but as I placed it atop my head, I remembered. I had not risen for revenge alone. I had risen, because I had to, for every girl who had been silenced in palace walls, for every woman used as a pawn in someone else's game, for every breath I had once begged to keep. I turned to face them, the court, the people, the traitors still kneeling behind veils of regret. And I spoke, not loud, but with the voice of someone who had come back from the dead. I was never meant to wear this crown. But now that I do, know this. Mercy is a choice. And so is destruction. A hush fell. Some wept. Some trembled. One man met my gaze with pride, not fear. Kale. He stood beside the guards, no longer in chains. His loyalty had been mocked, his name dragged through dirt. But he had never betrayed me. He had stood through it all. Not just for me, but with me. And when I stepped down from the dais, I did not walk alone. He took my hand. No words, just the warmth of someone who had known my scars and stayed. Not because I was a queen, but because he remembered the girl beneath the silk. They thought the fire would consume me, but it became the light I walked through. Every betrayal, every blade, every whisper behind closed doors. I wore them now not as scars, but as silk. The kind no dagger could pierce. I stood at the edge of the lotus garden, the one where I used to hide from court duties as a girl. Back then, I dreamed of love, of freedom, of a world where I could be both soft and strong. But the world had chosen war instead. So I learned to survive. And then I learned to rise. Behind me, the empire stirred. The traitors had been unmasked. Some vanished. Some broken by their own ambition. Some, like my stepsister Linen, had crumbled without needing a sword. She wept in the hall where she once crowned herself in front of the mirror. Power that is stolen never lasts. And yet the pain lingered like perfume that refused to fade. I turned toward the sound of footsteps. Kale. He did not bow. Not anymore. He walked to me like he always did. As if we were still in the woods, years ago, before the world knew my name. Do you regret it? He asked. The war, the throne, the vengeance, the quiet rage I had brewed for years, then served cold with a smile. I looked at the sky. The sun was rising, and with it, something inside me loosened. No, I said softly, because I did not just burn. I bloomed. I took his hand, and together we walked away from the palace, just for a moment, down the stone path lined with cherry blossoms. The empire would wait, but right now I needed to feel like a girl again. Just for a heartbeat. I leaned into his shoulder. Not empress, not weapon. Just woman. Alive.